Okay, welcome back to the Games Make a Difference esports symposium. Our next panel is entitled Games Will Make a Difference by Engaging Students in Classrooms and Lecture Halls. Your panelists are Dr. Geri Gillespy, Senior Program Manager for Global Education Engagement at Microsoft, Dr. Chantal Levesque-Bristol, Executive Director of the Center for Instructional Excellence at Purdue University, Bill Dever, Chief Strategy Officer with Harina Data, and Dr. William Watson, Associate Professor of Learning Design and Technology, and the Director of the Purdue Center for Serious Games and Learning in Virtual Environments. And once again, your moderator, James O'Hagan.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for being here. As somebody who is involved in K-12 and speaking to administrators, specifically as an administrator myself, speaking to them about gaming and esports coming into schools, I see firsthand the cross-eyed or apprehensive stares or the shaky questions that I get when I bring up gaming and esports in schools. As somebody who started this path personally back in 2014, at a conversation that happened just by chance in a hallway in Rockford, Illinois at the school district office. It was nice to find an administrator who got it. But as we know, many times there are not administrators who quote unquote get it, what we're trying to do. So with that idea, I did give our fine panelists here a question that we were going to start the conversation with. And I wanted to open this question up to Dr. Gillespy first and let her lead this off. So, Dr. Gillespy, through the lens of games making a difference by engaging students in the classroom and lecture halls, if you are going to talk to an apprehensive school administrator or parent about making gaming more accessible, what would be your pitch? What is the most powerful research you draw upon to make your point?
So I've been in this place many times. I was a building principal back when I would say that was the first educational crisis, and that was a recession here in the United States, 2008, 2009. I had just got my new building, 632 students, 5 federal programs. It was a title school, EL for pre-K to 5, staff of 67, and cut instructional days. Zero support as far as getting vice principals or anything else, just because of resources in education at the time. And then, by the way, we were in testing assessment jail from No Child Left Behind. So I had 6 months to get the school back up where it needed to be. So I have, being an educator who has always been in this space where, I was the one who, I started teaching in California and created students who had to learn about the gold mining. We packed up and went up to Sutter's Mill and had to get in the environment in experiential learning. So I was the administrator, I know to hear that too, who went to the school board and fought for Minecraft in the classroom before it was owned by Microsoft Education. I was just super happy when it did become part of Microsoft Education Suite, because then it was easier for me to get where I needed to go, and where I could step back. And I will tell you the same thing that I told the school board when I was there in that administrator, is that when I did inherit this building, I went back, and we always know as educators, we look at what any kind of research, and I could pull through anything. We've got some brilliant people on this panel. They could even pull out research that talks about the importance of formative assessment, student engagement, filling safe environments, clarity in instruction, knowing what needs to happen. All of these things, goal setting, those are the traits that are part of game-based learning and gaming. There is goals, there are rules, there is formative assessment system, and there are clear outcomes. That parallels exactly what we want to happen in instruction. It also engages students and gives them the opportunity to dive into those experiences that help them learn. So when we learn now, that's how we learn. When you learned how to ride a bike, your parents did not pull out a 20-slide PowerPoint and say, hey, this is what's going to happen. Daddy's going to turn the training wheels off, take the training wheels off, and you're going to get on this bike and let us know, right? We'll get your feedback at the end. it's experiences. It's putting them in. If you saw Stephen's presentation earlier today, you saw the experience that can come. So I start really listening to where they're at, but bringing back about how this is parallel to what we want to happen as an administrator in the classroom.
Now, follow up to this, after hearing that, this is for, first of all, I want it noted that there are 2 Canadians, I believe, on the panel here. So that's that we have a 50-50 split. But this one is for Dr. Levesque-Bristol. Now, the Center for Instructional Excellence, there may be people on campus here who understand it. There may be people who do not. But tell me, Dr. Levesque-Bristol, how does, or again, let's not even talk about the apprehensiveness. How do you see games or gaming or esports fitting into the Center for Excellence, the Center for Instructional Excellence in all of this?
Yeah, well, I want to piggyback on something that, Geri talked about, really the engagement piece, right? So everything that we do in the center when we work with instructors, because very generally we work with everybody, right? Faculty, tenure track faculty, lecturers that are not tenure track, graduate students who engage in teaching as well, right? So it's the whole instructional endeavor. It's really about engagement, and the tools that we're using, the techniques that we're using, the way that we teach, it's really not about what we do, it's really about how we do it, right? And these tools and technologies are a way to engage. You can engage with your voice, you can engage with PowerPoint, you can engage with games, and we can engage very well with games. And as you mentioned, there are rules, it's structured, it's tied to outcomes, right? So in our work, we really look at the way that instructions is set up and looking at how you design a course where there's learning outcomes, and then your assessment and your activities are tied to your learning outcomes. Well, in a game setting environment, that's really what happens. And if you think about it, I don't want to just say, well, life is a game, but in a way, it is. And when you really feel engaged and motivated, it's about feeling this sense of joy and passion and engagement, right, that you derive when you're playing a game. So there's this idea, we talk about basic psychological needs, and that's the type of research that I would really draw upon, and that I do draw upon in my work every day, is that as human beings, when we feel like we have these 3 basic needs that are met, which are autonomy, a sense of choice, agency, competence, which is mastery. I mean, that's built in, it's baked in, right? And the games that are very successful are the ones where you know how you're going to build your competencies and achieve different levels and continue. So that's the competency piece. And then relatedness, the sense of belongingness and engagement with others, your community. And that's, again, is very much built in. I was talking about why I play games. It's to engage with my kids that are now across the country, right? And we just jump on and have a conversation and then play a game. So I'll stop here, but it's baked into everything that we do in instruction. It's that we need to really bring back this enjoyment and fun, because that's really essential to how human beings grow and develop.
Well, I have to say that you're speaking my language, because the code that I heard was self-determination theory. So When you talked about the relatedness, the competency, those are core to that. And I know that I know there's a lot of apprehension around gaming because some people see them as addictive. I see more as that they are intrinsically motivated by these feelings of relatedness and competency and autonomy to play these games. Dr. William Watson, again, you are part of the serious games and learning in virtual environments through the School of Education. I imagine too that some of your peers in the School of Education may see games and gameplay. There may be nerves. I'm not saying they're going to say no to games and gameplay, but are there nervous administrators even in our own departments, or educators that you come up with who, they understand that, yes, we got to have recess time, but they may not see that as being carry over into, say, the video game world?
I think most people get it. And I think when you look at schools and whether they adopt educational video games or whether they adopt, problem-based learning or other learner-centered sort of pedagogies, it's what are your values? And whether we're talking PBL or whether we're talking video games, we have different sorts of outcomes. So like you were saying, we could teach how to ride the bike with a PowerPoint slide, and we could do it very quickly. Is it going to be that effective? Probably not, right? So what are you valuing as an administrator? What are you valuing as a school? Are you valuing coverage, that we can cover the most amount of material in the least amount of time with the least amount of resources? If that's what you're valuing, then games are probably not for you, much like PBL are not for you. If the outcome you're most focused on is raising test scores, and the tests are testing standardized certain things that are not, real life, they are not complex problems, they're very isolated from each other, then you're not going to see learning-centered pedagogies like PBL or video games have a great effect there. So a lot of it is about what are we valuing as administrators, what are we valuing as parents? If we're valuing mastery, if we're valuing critical thinking, if we're valuing collaboration, if we're valuing these sorts of deeper skill sets rather than surface level knowledge, then we want to look to pedagogies that are going to help us meet those sorts of things. So I think people get it. Where the hesitation is, well, that's hard, so I don't want to do it. And that's the case with a lot of different pedagogies, whether it's games or, again, like I said, PBL. We have decades of research showing these pedagogies work, but are they going to work in the short term to raise standardized test scores? No. Are they going to work to create engaged, motivated, self-regulating learners who can solve novel problems that are real-world based? Yes. So it's about what are we trying to prepare people for with our systems of education. I would argue that whether we're in higher ed or whether we're K-12, a lot of our systems of education are focused on what we needed education to be 150 years ago as opposed to what we need it to be now.
And Bill, Bill Dever, is somebody who hears these perspectives from largely academic, your company, Harena, or the company you work for, Harena Data, has taken a bit of a different approach. You work with schools directly, students directly when it comes to esports and competition. You have run some very successful, what do we call them?
Combines.
Combines, thank you, to help kids get found by colleges. But I can imagine that you too face the experience of having those nervous administrators who say, why do we do this? Why do we want to do this? You've worked with Indiana Sports Corps and trying to talk with them. How have you and Harena Data and Gio come about making the conversation with, like, for example, parents, administrators, or with Indiana Sports Corps?
I'm pretty lucky. I'm the child of one of the board members of the National Association of Secondary School Principals. I was educated under the Learning Environments Consortium, which was led by Bill Georgiadis out of USC, which was individual learning styles. We as a company, and I'm one of the founders of the company, one of the primary owners, we're very concerned about inclusion. We're very concerned about a child liking himself through the process we're offering them. That's the most important thing, is the child being more self-aware, being more confident, and just generally liking themselves. We're not trying to put a square peg in the round hole. One of the things we have as an educational body is we do not properly address learning styles. We don't properly address inclusion of awkward kids. Believe it or not, I was not a star athlete, but if video games existed when I was a child, I imagine I'd be playing video games and doing it quite well. For us, it comes from liberation theology of technology, allowing the child to determine their path, determine their model. Like we saw the walkabout model, which is one of the things our company's very inspired by in Australia, where a child takes 40 days, almost Christ's time in the desert, to go talk about a certain subject. And they can do it through gaming. They can go through process of gaming, could learn how to game. We're working with a company called Code Combat, where kids can compete with each other, developing their own games with a platform. For us, it becomes down to the point where gaming is just a medium for self-determination and self-expression. And we have to get more towards the idea of individualized learning, assessing learning patterns, and letting the administrators know that it's the kid that counts. It's not the report you got to file into Indianapolis. It's not whether you fail as a school or succeed. It's the small battles that you win with a child's self-conception. That's the most important thing for us as a company.
Well, and to follow up, Bill, and I'm gonna come right back to you. And again, if there's any people here in the audience or people on Zoom who have questions for our panelists, please make sure you either here raise your hands or bring the question into the Zoom chat. But Bill, to follow up again, as somebody who is sitting here, I know that Dr. Gillespy works for Microsoft, but Microsoft is tentacles in a lot of different places. Harena is very focused into the gaming space. What are some of your thoughts about appropriate corporate sponsorships in the K-12 space? Because we know that there are some of the concerns that school administrators have is around things like school data privacy or being able to have a company that is, we'll just say, upfront and honest and transparent about how they operate. So when you as again Harena Data go to a school or again like an Indiana Sports Corps to discuss sponsorships or partnerships, how do you approach maybe that idea?
We just went through the process. We founded the Canadian Collegiate Esports League. And we have 22 schools. And I'm just going to give you a scenario. We let them define their own parameters for sponsorship. We have no right to impose it. They have to determine it themselves. The body and the school body and the district or the corporation have to determine the level of their comfort. We're the only platform that is Safe Harbor acknowledged. We don't give out our data. We don't only give it out to the players. We don't sell it. We use it for leaderboards. But for the most part, data is property and we don't give it out. And we are very respectful, and we went through a full Safe Harbor audit just to make sure that no one, Kelvin, right there. There you go, buddy. No problem. But at the end of the day, that data is the child's property. It's not Harena's property. It's not even the school corporation's property. And one of the things we do is we engage parents in that process, because either the child has to be satisfying COPA regulations, or we have to get the guardian or the parent involved somehow. And we ask them to set up the accounts, and we also make sure that the parents have the ability to monitor those accounts. And then whenever we're doing a tournament, we always have referees on site just to make sure everyone's behaving themselves in the Discord channel. And if they're not, out they go. Or we send Kelvin out to get them.
Now, as far as Bill coming back, not Bill, sorry, Dr. Watson. Sorry, there's two Bills on the panel here today.
Bill, there you go, I know.
When you think about this, again, from your position as far as realizing that big data, especially at the teenage years, is so important. From your perspective at the center, how do you guys approach the conversation around data privacy, specifically within games and gameplay?
Well, it's a question, and it's an important question going forward, because it's a question that's not always been addressed a lot. But that being said, the outcomes that we can get from that data to be used for good, we can't just squash the progress we could make because we haven't addressed it. So it's refreshing to hear what you're saying and how you're handling things. Wish more companies would do that. But getting to personalization of instruction and a personalized system of education for individuals is essential. Part of the work that we do is envisioning what a personalized learning management system would be. And, I've talked to companies about that. And essentially, even I've talked with Purdue developers around that. And the question is always, well, no one's really teaching in a personalized way right now, so why do we need to develop the tool? Well, if the tool was there, maybe they would be teaching in a personalized way. When we talk to school districts about adopting these sorts of approaches, the challenge is that they have to do all the heavy lifting themselves because those tools are not there in place. So while the data, it's an important, and I would say from the ground up, that needs to be a core concept of how we are protecting the data and how we are safeguarding the data. if a tool was like that was in place, I think we would see a lot more schools, school districts, administrators who would get around this concept that treating 12-year-olds like they're all the same because they're 12 is frankly ridiculous, because we all know innately that they have different skills and abilities. Some are going to be whizzes in literature, while others are going to be really struggling in math, or a whiz in math and struggling in literature. To say you have this amount of time on the calendar to learn this content, and if you don't learn it, too bad, it just doesn't make sense. And so I think moving from a time-driven system to a learning-based system where people are given the amount of time they need to learn something, whether it's less time or it's more time, and then they can progress an optimal level. Whether we're talking games, which again, good games do exactly that sort of thing. They have it optimized in a level where you proceed at the pace that's just right for you. That is so important to motivation, to engaged learning, to self-regulated learning, that I think the data is an important thing we need to keep focused on while this develops, but we do need to be developing for this sort of system. Because by and large, when you talk to people, whether it's administrators at higher ed or K-12 level, they all get it. They all understand that yes, we should not let the calendar be driving everything, and that yes, people are different, and we can't treat them all the same. But how do you get to managing that sort of complex system where every student is learning something different at their own pace that's just right for them? You have to have technology there to support that, and data has to be a big piece of that. So I would say, yes, it's very important for us to keep that focused, but we also need to start taking those leaps and not just waiting for it to magically happen when the tools aren't there for people.
Dr. Levesque-Bristol, Dr. Watson brought up something interesting. He talked about motivation, especially around games. Something I've heard a lot, the term used is gamification, which again is more of an extrinsic motivating tool. Do you feel that gamification has been overused or sometimes misused, or is a term that's kind of being thrown around? Sorry, I'm trying to look around the TV here.
I'm using the mirror.
Thank you. Yeah, you just use the mirror. So, but unfortunately, you're like on a crease on the mirror for me.
I know. I'm leaning. Me too. So you're kind of separated.
I think he just called you a crease. I go down.
I'm kind of like, not quite. Yeah, that's a great question. And I just kind of want to jump back to sort of like what Dr. Watson was talking about. In education, just essentially, we've made sort of a very big mistake that used to work for a long, long time, is that we think about learning as the variable and time is the constant. And we really need to flip this, right? So and that worked, right? Because it helps with when we had just a room, and amphitheaters were created with this purpose, get everybody into a room and deliver content. And that used to work when that was the way that we had access to knowledge, right? There was an authority figure delivering content, and you had a certain amount of time, and whatever learning you demonstrated in that time, that's what you had. But we now know, and with the pandemic, I think that's one of the positives of the pandemic, is that now we know that it's possible, right? And it's kind of like what you're talking about, develop the tools, and perhaps we'll have the ability to do these things with learning that we know are good to do, but we don't do because we don't have the tools. So that's, but with the access to all kinds of modalities of engagement, right? So why the time is so much less relevant now. Learning is what we need to be focused on, and learning is the constant. Time is the variable. So just wanted to piggyback on that. In terms of the gamification, I think that we often come up with terms that seems just kind of like sexy, for lack of better word, or just better word, and just like, okay, this is something new that we can grab a hold of, and but I think that overused, just maybe misused even, and then I think it puts the focus on the wrong aspect, where it sounds to be like, oh, if this is something fun, therefore not serious, when in fact, engagement, right? So I would like to kind of change the conversation to fun, because it's a hard term to define, right? What is fun? There are things that we would consider fun that are very difficult, right? I'm a distance runner and a cyclist, and I biked 200 miles for fun at one time. Yes, a lot of people say that's crazy. I think that's fun, but the definition of fun is even nebulous, right? So to say that we're going to gamify something, I think kind of gives it sort of a bad, like, oh, well, that's not serious. It's fun, therefore cannot be brought into a classroom environment or a learning environment. When really, especially in terms of self-determination theory, we talk about motivation, engagement, and engagement, and thinking about motivation that we call identified, where you find the value and the importance, and also integrated, where it's part of who you are. It becomes part of your sense of self. So we talked about self-regulation, definition, identity, as opposed to just fun, which in our framework of motivation is a very limited slice, right? Fun is something that's intrinsic, that you do it just as it's not a means to an end. You do it just because it's fun, just because of the enjoyment. And there's very few things in life that we do without trying to achieve an outcome, right? And that would take that piece out. So yes, motivation, I love that. So I don't know if that really answered your question, or if I'm kind of.
Well, again, I always worry about too much gamification, because as we know, things that people already want to do, or they'll get up in the morning and do, and when you start putting extrinsic motivations on them, that takes the joy and the fun out of what it is that they do. Say, for example, I know a lot of library systems during the summer will do reading clubs. Well, there may be a child who already is a heavy reader, but there's been, I know, some research that shows when the library says, okay, you only need to read 10 books this summer, sometimes that mindset of, I read my 10 books, I don't have to read anymore, all of a sudden has shifted the intrinsic love of reading to something that is for a prize. Even a simple, the gold stars kind of thing that we used to get as kids in school. Those are some of the things that I worry about, because it seems that everybody wants to take video games and just kind of, again, use them in some different way, shape, or form without really even thinking about the consequence of using that medium.
Right.
Is that because it's easy, or because it's spoken in the vernacular right now?
I would open that up to the panel.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here a little bit, because only we've heard a lot of this, and I just want to bring up here. When we talk about education, especially public education, and now I work with educators worldwide, it is a complex institution. It is the complexity of it all the way through here that are gone here. And you've heard different, I agree with everything that's been said on this panel, especially with the engagement pieces and the personalization and the mastery. I can tell you, like in the beginning of my story, which I mentioned, I had that 6-week window to get out of a then testing assessment jail. We did. We became one of the top performing schools in the state. And then when I went to district level, because of what we were able to accomplish at the school level, we became one of the most top performing districts in the country. And those, we're talking standardized testing. So I have seen it done where you can use, putting together mastery. In that time, we put together 3 mastery-based high schools where we went, where time was not a factor. Where I'm saying is we have to be intentional, which goes back to your question, which goes back to what you're saying. There has to be an intentional purpose, bringing in this great theory, the great things we know about education. And that's where I'm here, and I will join any panel that will talk to administrators, teacher leaders, anyone who can make these choices, these decisions, and say, use what you know as an educator. You hear these, that we know this works, and that is why it works. When we are intentional and put this forward, we have students who are willing participants who want to learn, ask questions, and the test scores come. Like my students, I didn't worry about what test you gave them. And unfortunately, and I wish we could change the world. I will be on that. I'll sign that doctrine anywhere. But it became in our district that where I was the administrator, our 5th graders were tested for our internal placements, for our state testments, for our national testments, then the placement to see how they did in the world, and then the final reading testament. And it was crazy between 3rd and 5th grade. And we're talking, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds just spending months and weeks of testing, when I talk about that. So I get that, but I can say I've seen this work. I've seen it work. And if I had to talk to administrators to create across with this, with gamification, and I understand that, it cannot become another term that we try to throw out there. There's other terms in education where we say, hey, have you done this? Because it becomes that pendulum of the next thing to talk about. I always say, step back, take a look where you're at. Earlier in the panels, when you said, how did I end up where I am? I work in the engineering department at Microsoft. I often ask for first 6 months I was there, how did I end up here? But it is the product development there. We are working on tools. There are tools for data so that we can do this and be able to make these changes. That's what Stephen and I fight for every day, and that's why we are in engineering. So I know that was long, but just listening to this, I think that is the big message here when we talk esports. Bring it into schools so we could support what's happening even with these esports leagues.
And I invite to the panelists to challenge each other. So if they're hearing something or if they feel like they need to extend a point, please just jump in and do that.
What's interesting is we're talking about unit creation, modularity that could be self-directed by the student. And I think everyone here, there's a consensus that education is right now is a process, and it's a process for statistics on a governmental or corporation level. At the end of the day, the term gamification should be really skewed towards self-creation. What environment are they creating for themselves that's defining themselves and letting them to speak out to the world? We're working on a project on neurodiversity, which is primarily kids on the spectrum. How do they use gaming and their interrelationship with gaming in communicating with the world that often doesn't get them and they often don't get the world? How does that act as a translator? And for me, the operating thing is liberation. It has to be about liberating the child and having the child liberate themselves through their own definition. Because what we need is a sentient, free-thinking population. We see what's happened when that sentience is not permitted. And we have to really liberate our society by first liberating the children, by throwing a lot of what we know about process education out the window and going back and defining it back to the needs of the child. How do we develop school systems as truly learning organizations where we're not teaching a kid a subject, we're teaching a child how to learn?
Let me ask this of the panelists, because again, we're talking about engaging students in the classroom and then the lecture halls. And I started off with what makes talking about the nervousness of administrators. What do we think makes, again, most administrators, I'm 46 years old, I'm an administrator. I've grown up playing video games. First ones I've played were like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man when I was a kid, pinball. What do you think still makes administrators nervous?
Government.
Yeah.
So Bill says government. Dr. Watson is shaking his head.
I think essentially getting people to take the leap like you're talking about, that you can get there doing these approaches, you can still get there, right? But I think they're beholden to certain responsibilities. You have to do X, Y, and Z, and they know how to do that in the current system. So why make that leap?
It is, and it goes all the way up from the top of leadership. So when I did get to an executive level in district, in working with, I worked with an amazing assistant superintendent who I reported to, and he just happened to be my administrator, my supervisor all the way through, even as a building principal. And I had the support to make these risks. And I'm going to say, if building administrators out there, I said earlier, I mentioned somebody, I said like my people. That was my favorite job. Do not tell Microsoft that was my favorite job ever, because you're so responsible for so much. You want, at the end of the day, every single student. When we say all, we mean all. That means everyone we're talking about on this panel, people feeling included, feeling part of your system. That means, families, parents, your staff, everything. When I sat back and I looked at, just myself, and their administration had larger school buildings, I had 630 students who had families and staff. At the end of the day, I was supporting 1,500 to 2,000 people that I felt responsible for. So I think it's that fear to feel supported, exactly what you're saying, to take that risk, because at the end of the day, that's what we want. That is what we want to do. We want to help people be successful.
The word that came to mind for me was rigor. There's this great conversation about lack of rigor or becoming less rigorous, and I think that's holding us back. I think it kind of goes back to, if it sounds like it's actually too much fun and engaging, maybe it's not rigorous enough. Learning is something that we do naturally. I talk about the basic needs. They are human and essential and fundamental. We're born with them. And when we see people that are disengaged, it's not because they're lazy, it's because the process has been stopped by an external force. You talked about, putting terms on things, right? So if you can take any activity that you enjoy to do and then start putting contingencies on it and constraints and control it because you think, well, guess what? We found something that works. Now let's apply it universally and force people into that model. It's going to break. It's not going to work because you violated those basic need principles. You suddenly put contingencies, and instead of becoming something that's intrinsic, which I said is very fleeting, that notion, it becomes very rapidly something that's fully extrinsically motivated, where you do it just because you have to. And you have to do it in a certain way and in a certain fashion. Competitiveness does the same thing, right? You could have played a game really because you enjoy it, and then somebody says, oh, you're really good at this. Let me give you a sponsorship and a contract, and now you're playing for money. It changes it. It's not the same. What happened is that you imposed constraint and contingencies. And that's sort of the balance that we have to work with. But I think in institution rigor, to me, that's what came to mind. I was like, well, it doesn't seem serious enough. It's a game. It's for fun. So where's the learning when in fact we learn all the time, every day through engagement and play? I love your example of want to ride a bike, want to learn how to play baseball. What do? Give the kid a baseball, give him and just throw, right? And then make adjustment. But keep it something that the child, the person, right? Think about yourself. When you have a good day, you feel like you had agency. You feel like you were competent. You had connections with people. Bad day, these things go away, right? If you feel controlled, it's not going to feel the same, even if you're good at it. It changes it. Anyway, I could go on and on, but yes. The idea is that we have to be careful with the language that we use and then taking something and making it fit and then forcing people into whatever that thing was, because even if it was really good, if you start to imposing the way that it should be done, it falls apart.
And if I could comment on that real fast. When I was a grad student, I was working with a school district that was trying to go into a personalized model of learning. And the recession hit, and what happened, they had to start riffing teachers who were their new hires who had been hired to teach in this sort of environment. So basically they were 5 years working on moving to a new system of education where every student is able to learn at their own pace rather than being time-based. The budget hit, they had to start firing the teachers they'd hired and trained to do this sort of thing. And basically all those changes they've been working on slowed to a crawl and eventually went away because they had things that they had to be doing. I had another case where I was describing a school that would operate in this sort of way in a personalized system. And a woman in the audience get very excited and say, oh, I went to school just like that. I was failing school. I went to this new school that allowed me to learn at my own pace in my own way. Suddenly the learning was fun. I was motivated. I was in control of my own learning. And I said, that's fantastic. Where was that school? And she was like, oh, it was right here in Indianapolis, but it's not like that anymore. And that's the sort of story we hear again and again and again. We operate within systems, and those systems pull back on the changes that we sort of make and pull everything back to the status quo. So there's a long history of extraordinary schools that have come out and done things in very innovative and effective ways. And then life happens and the system happens and that goes away.
There was something I wanted to go back to Dr. Levesque-Bristol about, because she kept bringing up play. And I want to remind people, it was Mr. Rogers who said, play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning, but for children, play is serious learning.
Bingo.
And I think that when you talk about rigor, play is not seen as rigorous.
That's right.
And so I wanted to ask Dr. Levesque-Bristol this as a follow-up for the Center of Instructional, and this is, I swear this is not an I gotcha, but I wanted to ask, does play have a place in the Center for Instructional Excellence?
Oh, absolutely. That's an easy question.
Oh,
that's an easy question.
We didn't get to talk before this panel, so this is she's got a lot going on today.
Well, I just published a book recently last year, so it's available. So I talk a lot more about this, but self-determination theory, and what I'm talking about here, is at the core of everything that we do. It's the way I run my center. It's the way that I build my team. They have lots of choices and options. I have a structure that I need to follow because I work within an institution, but we talk about this all the time. Play, enjoyment, fun, and is part of what we do because it's essential to human life. When you feel this activation inside of you, that's when learning happens. And when you said that quote, and I said, yes, bingo, that's exactly what it is. It doesn't happen if you're not engaged, and that's what being alive is. So yes, everything. This is how I run my center. This is how I work with my team. This is how I build my team. This is how I talk about instructors, about what will work with students. I don't use the word play because, again, I think it's that idea of rigor, but I use engagement, motivation, self-determination, joy. I definitely use joy. And yes, so easy. I could go on and on about this. It's how you do professional development. It's how you do mentorship. It's how I raise my kids. And I've had very difficult conversation with my kids because when you open this up, I have a funny story. So I've been doing this all my life, and I had my youngest, actually when he was my young one, my oldest was saying it was time for dinner, right? And I was like, it's time for dinner. We are going to get together and we're going to eat and talk. And he says, I'm not hungry. And I said, well, it's time for dinner. He says, I'm not hungry now. He says, what's the goal? And he was 6. What's the goal? I said, I want us to have togetherness. We've been running around. He's like, all right, I'll sit here and I'll talk. I'm just not hungry. And I thought, wow. He's like, right now you're not supporting my autonomy. True story. And I thought, okay, you're absolutely right. But when we're stressed and tired, we revert to those modes like you're talking about, right? You take away the good idea that takes more time and you revert back to older system, which are time. It's not as difficult time-wise to be controlling as opposed to being autonomy supportive, right? But he was absolutely right. I'm like, all right, let's talk. That's really what the goal, right? So what is the outcome? What's the learning outcome? And you talked about that you want to achieve, and then focus on that. And then the rest becomes, and he ate later. He don't worry, he's the one that eats a lot. He didn't starve. He ate later when he felt like eating. And I thought, that's beautiful. So careful what you ask for, like also how, but yes. Easy question. Sorry, I'm just going to stop here because I could go on.
So,
And I wanted to, sorry, I'll let you, Bill, 1 second. One second. I wanted to add too, that if you have not looked at, and one of the things I admire about Dr. Levesque-Bristol's department is it's not just the Center for Instructional Excellence, but it is diversity excellence. When I look at the faces of the people who are a part of that department, it is truly probably one of the most diverse departments that I have seen on Purdue campus. And I think that's important when we're talking about instructional excellence. So I thank you for that. Bill, sorry, go ahead.
You sure?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. 70% of Americans' home have a gamer in it. Gaming really is a touch point. It's a touch point of accessing an interest, a pre-existing interest within a child from which you can build on. Gamification, if you build something and you expect a kid to fit into it automatically without taking their own learning style into approach, it's not going to work out. You have to come from the strength of the individual and create tool sets from which they can produce games, they can produce writing, they can produce art. It has to be self-motivated. Gamifying everything, like I can fool around with this paper and it could be a game. At the end of the day, you have to develop self-realization for the child in that environment. If you want a child to respect education, you first have to respect the child.
So as a kind of a follow-up, I guess, because you brought up a very interesting statistic, Bill, about having, what did you say, 70% of each home has a gamer in it. And I guess, again, for those nervous administrators who may be thinking about, well, I don't know if I should bring video games into school or whatever, is there a statistic or is there something that you share specifically as an anecdote or like a fact with an administrator to help them realize just how important this is, or that maybe their efforts are a bit underfunded? The one that I point to is when I drive around my community and I drive by an elementary school, I look at the playground, and if the playground is just this absolute, 1950s, 60s death trap, I go, well, maybe play isn't nearly as important as we say it is. But if I drive by a school and I want to jump out and potentially break a bone, playing on whatever the device is or the construction is, that to me is my gauge, I guess, for a quality play experience at the school. Is there anything that anybody wants to share, whether it is about video games, esports, or like I said, we'll talk about it just in the idea of play?
I think you're narrowly defining play.
Go ahead.
I think play is any kind of searching, involvement, engagement at a child level that is in terms of learning and pleasure combined. That I think is replicable. They may not be on the swing set, but they're going to be with their cell phones playing Minecraft. They're going to be doing some form of origination. There's going to be some form of engagement with something. When I was a kid, I used to love playing G.I. Joes, and I was invading Burma or doing whatever. They have taken those G.I. Joes and put them in game. I am a movie producer by vocation, and I have produced some of the worst movies ever made. Sharknado, I put it in the movie theaters.
Okay.
So I'm very proud. But the whole idea of movies have gone into gaming. They're telling stories, they're engaging in stories, they're defining their own stories. Minecraft is fascinating. Kids are basically making their own movies in Minecraft. It's you have to respect the kid. You can't define what play is to them, and you have to have the strength of character, the strength of administration to allow to them to decide themselves.
I agree. I totally agree. And I would say it was too, I always come in at when I have these, like I said, I have these conversations a lot, all the time. I also say too, in education, as a teacher, as an administrator, we all want to meet, especially the learner where they're at. And it doesn't matter whether I'm doing professional development, if I'm training other administrators, if I was a teacher, we want to meet them where they're at. No better way to meet them where they're at than, I appreciate what you said about looking at their interests and not trying to put them, in a place and an easy, like an entry spot, especially for an administrator, is your after school programs, is the community development, is those places that you can meet them where they're at, because I was constantly looking at ways to reach out to my community. This is a true fact, you can go through and look at statistics and ask parents, even if they're upset with their school district at the time, US, they will always rate their school higher than their district, because the school is the center of the community. It is the place. When I had to do events as a district administrator, I never did one as a school. I get like 10 people there. If I went through a school and went through that school community, I would have a school full of just people who would come and engage. And so this is a great way to work with, and I talked to a lovely person yesterday in the state of Indiana who's got partners in doing this, and I'm like, there's so many things we could do to support this in community outreach and bringing this through, because I have children who are athletes. And I'm telling you, like you said, you brought up the football analogy. Yes, they were out playing t-ball, soccer, football all the way through. I did support play and sport and any video games and that they wanted to play in our household as well. But that becomes part of this play. And we bring it in the schools, we bring in the community. It becomes something we just do. When I had those first kindergarten parents that came in, even pre-K, they want their students to do well. But the first question, every parent, and it didn't matter of any ethnicity or culture or where they came from, they wanted their children happy. They wanted to know their children felt safe. They wanted to know their children felt wanted. And so that is where you come at as an administrator. This is the one way, I'm telling you, this is the hidden secret, the gem. That's why I love talking to administrators that are on that limb.
And I know too that as somebody who faces it every day in the K-12 environment, but even before the pandemic, we had a issue with trauma and mental health, the rise of mental health trauma. The pandemic has exacerbated that. We have students coming to us who are in crisis, coming to campus as freshmen without knowing potentially anybody in crisis. How is it that we can use, there's been some examples of how games can be used at the high school level. How can we do this, especially for the incoming college student, to engage them in ways that, because we know that two ways to push against a mental health crisis, one is through positive adult interaction and the other one is through play. Does anybody have any examples either on the panel to share as ways that they have seen unique ways in which play has been used in colleges?
I've seen it in adults. My sister, who I love, special education teacher for as long as I've been in education, so over 25 years. She has an adult program, 18 to 21-year-olds right now. During the pandemic, she is all about job skills, social skills, using Minecraft. Thanks to the genius of Stephen Reid over there, could create worlds for social stories and communication. And we had conversations yesterday with some just amazing faculty on this campus about even helping people talk through those social stories.
Just talk.
Yeah.
Just learn how to talk.
Learn how to talk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I go back and I reflected right away. I thought of my my sister, and that is exactly what she was doing in creating those situations, because creating those digital environments.
We even talked about yesterday, if you wanted to share the experience of before a student walks onto campus, how we can use games as a way to introduce them to campus life. Did you want to share that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, yes. Oh, go ahead.
No.
What?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was not on that.
Yes, we did.
I could come up with
We
something, but I was not in those conversations.
Yes, we talked about, and I would honestly, definitely would bring it on here, is creating. I mean, you saw what we saw. We had Hogwarts. Why not create a university model?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not have that university? And then as they come in, I also have, I have older children who's been through college, but I'm worried about my daughter. My daughter is 17, she's a junior. She's starting to look at campuses. In fact, I'm running home for a college tour. And I do fear that a way for her to engage and find resources and know how to have those conversations. And we talked about having even resources, because within those tools in Microsoft and Minecraft, which Stephen kind of went through, they have immersive reader built in, so that you can hear people even, it translates to 110 different languages with one push. You could have links in there to resources that you have on the campus. You can have that where it becomes just a virtual welcome into, I often tell administrators and educators, like I always call my work like a big Microsoft hug. You could actually have, I know the elementary teachers comes out often. You can do that here and have all these resources. So right from the very beginning, where it's a scary time.
Yeah. At Purdue, we do a great job. We have the Boiler Gold Rush, BGR. This sort of week-long series of events that is done in person, and it's a lot of like games, right? There's teams, there's you go with your college, you get to know the university, where to find things, right? Well, why not bring in all of the modalities? You could even have things that are face-to-face, things that are virtual, build community, which I think is essential to this idea of engagement and fun, right? Is like it's with people, building community, but also through these games, like having, I think that what we're losing, you talked about communication, just being able to talk to each other, resolve conflicts, talk about problem-based learning. There's a lot of that's been lost, especially through the pandemic, right? People were in isolation. Just a quick story, you mentioned like a map of campus and how to find things. Things that happened through the pandemic that we didn't really realize as administrator is that the students have never stepped foot in certain buildings on campus at all, right? There used to be tons of event in the PMU in the ballrooms, right? So if you were part of a fraternity or a sorority or a club, there was a lot of these large events that happened there. That's gone completely away in the past 2 years. I was in the PMU yesterday for a conference of my own that I'm running, and I was seeing all these students walking by, and it's very odd because I'm like, why aren't the students walking by? And then I have still a son here, and then I look at my phone and my son's calling. He never calls. I'm like, it's an emergency, somebody's dying. And he says, where's the ballroom? And I'm like, oh, that's why all these students. So I told them there was this big class. They were doing a practice presentation. They had no idea where the ballroom was. Happened to know the instructor, so I walked down the ballroom. And she's like, I've never experienced this before. Then we started talking. Well, they have not been on campus. Most of these students were sophomores. Some of them were juniors. They've never been on campus. They've not had their clubs or activities. And we forget about this, right? So think about using Minecraft, gaming to to think about, okay, that's what the campus is going to look like. This is how you find your way around. But one student that I stopped, they said, I know what you're looking for. That was like 20 minutes later. I said, you're looking for the ballroom? He's like, yes. He's like, how'd you know? I'm like, it's like I've been looking for this place for 40 minutes. Literally. So,
You know, what's interesting, my son had his first year university, and it was under lockdown. So he goes to a Canadian university. And we feel so bad for him. He's got to take it remotely. It's awful, but he's bringing this back to a gaming focus. We hear him yelling and screaming downstairs. I said, he snapped. The pressure's too much. No, he's on his Xbox talking to his friends who are going to Trent University remotely, engaging with them.
yeah,
And, you know, and we said, thank God.
yeah, absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
I think,
If I could hop in real fast.
Yeah,
just
please.
Very briefly, I think the play thing that we keep bringing up, and it's been brought up again and again, is an aspect of play is safety, right? And an aspect of games is failure. If you fail in a game, it's not a big deal, right? You learn and you try and you get better. So that's not how college is structured, right? You're not allowed to fail. You fail, you're in trouble. So I think the play aspect, how you can't have play if there's not that safety net there to explore, to create, to fail, and learn from failures. So just in general, I just wanted to comment that on that when we talk about bringing play in and when we talk about gamification, often the gamification is we're trying to lay this lens on top of what's already there. So we're not in a game level, we're trying to make it kind of game-like, but not really, right?
well, and gamification shouldn't be vilified. I just think that sometimes potentially is overused. But what I will add to what you just said, Dr. Watson, is I'm also thinking too about the comment of how we're not set up here to fail. But there are students, brilliant children who are coming to us with horrible trauma, horrible shame. I know that there's a situation, there was did a conversation, my girlfriend did a conversation with a director up in Madison. And I assume Purdue has a very similar kind of setup and feature for students that may be coming from low socioeconomic means. But there's money set aside for rent, for computers, for classes, for these students who are already either coming out of foster care and carrying, again, trauma and shame. And they can't get them in the door to come in and get the services. I mean, literally, it's to show up and they will give them services and supports that they never even realized were available to them because the shame is so strong. But again, as you were alluding to, in a game environment, gamify the campus where they can practice walking to, knowing exactly where to go, knowing who they're going to talk to them. Let them walk through that experience of asking for help, which for some children, when the shame is so high, asking for help is the hardest thing they can do. We can use these games to help train children to, again, get the help and supports that they need. We're going to have so much need coming up. Again, seeing this from the K-12 level, we haven't hit the crest yet of what the trauma is looking like from our students coming back into the classroom right now. These things may manifest slowly or they may manifest all at once, but these game experiences can allow children at least to start to practice and not feel potentially exposed or vulnerable in these situations where, again, shame and trauma can trump everything else that's going on in their lives.
You have a question?
Yeah, so you guys have talked about how you use resource and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about best practices for the actual games themselves. Like what kind of mechanics and what kind of tools in the games do you see being very effective for the learning outcome?
Great question.
So we're looking at, so again, just so people can hear it if they couldn't hear it already, and this will help me reiterate the question. You're looking at what are some of the things that games should include in order to be best engagement tools. Are you an engineering student? Computer science. Okay, all right. So we have somebody from a computer science lens looking at this.
Jump in on that one.
You first have to take a look at the game itself. You know, are you matching the outlook, the presentation, the methodology of the game? Does it meet with your audience? Like we're doing consulting work right now for a group of movie theaters in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, it's this game haram, haras, or halal. You know, there's all kinds of dynamics. So we first have to look at the viewpoint of the user. Is it compatible with the ethos of the organization or of the endemic culture? I think that's the first point.
And I would add that I think It's really important to consider what your goals are for the game. Ultimately, the game is a tool. So as an example, when I talk to teachers about using games, I had a teacher who used The Sims to teach sociology. So if you were a sociologist studying people, if you're familiar with The Sims, when they talk to each other, they're just babbling in Siamese, right? It's not a real language. So he was using that to have his students study. If you're a sociologist and you encounter these people having these interactions, you don't understand the language, how would you describe that as a sociologist, right? Sims was never designed for that, right? That's not something they had a goal of doing. So it's about understanding what you want to use it for, and how you're going to get those outcomes from it as a tool. The other thing I would say is, as a tool, and as a tool that people are going to use differently, the more flexibility and control you can give to those people on how to use it, the better. If they have to play it for an hour and a half at a time before they can save, right? Or they can't come back to it. Those sorts of practical things of flexibility and how they're going to be able to use it and adapt it for their purposes is really important.
Real quickly, if you're interested in the research, I would point you to the work of Scott Rigby. And we talked about self-determination theory, which looks at the satisfaction of the basic needs within a game environment. And what you just talked about, the control, that would be that sense of autonomy. So the more autonomy, and then he varies like the amount that the needs are met within the game system, and then sees the outcome that follows. So
Dr. Levesque, could you say that again, please?
Rigby is the last name?
Rigby?
Yep. And I would also, I'm going to put on that too, I would go along with that is even from a learning outcome space. So there is, and if you come to the reception, I know Stephen could show you even a world that we just worked on that he did some amazing work on too, which is about literacy. And I would say even when you can bring back, and I've mentioned this earlier, when you can be intentional as an instructor, as someone who's going to help facilitate learning, there has to be that level of autonomy also for an instructor to be able to make those choices on and off. So a lot of, in fact, I think you saw even when Stephen was demonstrating and gone in there, you can go from a player mode to a creative like learning mode to that too, because I appreciate so much what you said about being able to fail, and having that option, that's really what you want to look at. So I would say even looking at how you're being intentionally from also the person in the learner who's going to be using a game, but also the person who can be intentional in the strategies that they want to use so that they can do what they do best, and that's to facilitate that learning. I know you're dying over here.
Can I just add to that?
We want to get you, come over here, Stephen. We want to get you on the microphone.
Sure, do you?
Yeah, because so Stephen, little song, little dance. We are getting into final thoughts, so I think we're pretty close to wrap here. So go ahead, Stephen.
Great. Okay, just a couple of things. One is in answer to your question, as someone who designs these spaces and has really had to work very hard over the last 20 years to figure out, because there was no research, and maybe I should have done it, but figure out what it was that was the winning formula for these things. I've kind of landed, certainly as a creator in these spaces, and as a creator intentionally designing for education, there's 3 magic ingredients that I find bring children to the table, keep children at the table, and allow them to succeed. And the first is give them an environment that they want to be in, give them somewhere they want. And that, think of that as your physical classrooms as well as your digital spaces. Mm-hmm. It's just like, make them want to come to campus, mm-hmm. make them want to sit in that classroom. And that includes this space that we're in right now. The second, complementary to that, is features, functions, and mechanics. Give them something to do. Mm-hmm. And actually this comes from the children. The children will say, right, where am I going? What world am I going to be in today? And I say to them, well, we're going to ancient Egypt. And they're like, yes. Or classically, I'll say, today we're going to do maths. And they go, oh, and I say, but we're doing it in Minecraft in a zombie apocalypse world called Mathpocalypse. And they go, yes. So we give them environments they want to be in. Awesome. We then give them features, functions, and mechanics that allow them to do stuff. So that self-determination, that journey that they take. And then the third and critical, and where I find that any one of these 3 is missing, it's a weaker world. Where any 2 of them are missing, don't bother. Right. And if all 3 of them are missing, what's the point? Right. But really, for me, the third one ties them all together as narrative. Put our children in a story that they believe in. Make them the hero. Make them think that the only reason they're going to ancient Egypt is because they have to stop a mummy from killing Howard Carter in 1922. Or, they're the only people that can get everyone out of Pompeii before Mount Vesuvius erupts. Or. And suddenly, I even did a science one on molecular science, and the way we sold it to them was the old 1980s movie Inner Space, where they put them in a submarine and inject them into the human body. Yes. Some of you will remember that. And,
Dennis Quaid.
good.
Right? And I was like, we're going to go into a Minecraft. Now, the world is not actually environmentally that great. It's just big molecules that they fly around in. But the minute I told them that they were in a tiny submarine and they were moving through this human body, they were like, cool. And they went in and they learned all about they came out the other side and said, I know what this is, and this is, and this is, and platelets are, and red blood cells, and the cancers and cures and all sorts of wonderful things that we'd sort of put in there on purpose. And they loved it. The other thing I just wanted to add while I've got the mic.
Steven.
And another thing. I'm so glad that we actually brought it back to play, though. Like, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether it's baseball or video games or hopscotch. Yep. The idea that this comes back to play is for me, it's the platform, the foundation on which all of this stands. And my question to the panel, because I'll make this a question rather than a statement. If I went outside right now, or anywhere I live, but here in Purdue, and I started climbing, I can see a tree from that window. If I started climbing that tree, someone would phone the police. Certainly faculty would get involved in some sort of security to come along because they'd be like, there's a man climbing it. I love climbing trees. I'm a rock climber, but to get me in a tree, it's just as good. But I'm not allowed because I've passed an age at which that's appropriate. And yet
we have a climbing wall. Like you can
that's right. So we'll pay hundreds of thousands to set up a climbing wall, but don't climb on the trees. But if a child climbed that, we'd all go, oh, he'll fall. And we would relish this playful act, but we're not allowed as adults. It's the same with, it's almost like putting play behind paywalls. We tell children now what they should wear to be a skateboarder, and we tell them where they should skateboard. And in fact, they don't do it in cities because we literally spend thousands, if not millions a year, making New York non-skateboardable, or London, you're not allowed to skateboard here, but you can skateboard there. And I think my question to the panel would be, this is clearly wider than academia. This is massively social for us. It's an issue that and a colleague of mine in the United Kingdom, and Debbie John, who runs an amazing service called Play Healing, she was talking about how 80% plus of parents don't value or do not know how to play with their children. That's the result of not allowing us to climb trees or not allowing us to skateboard in cities, is we forget how to play. So my question to the panel is, this is clearly bigger than academia. How do we make this, how do we solve that outside of academia first?
You get rid of the concept of commoditizing and commercializing fear. That's the issue. They can make money off fear. Look at after 9/11, red, green, blue, purple, chartreuse, levels of fear. You can program it. If you want to control a population, you make them fearful.
Well, and after 9/11, we also had No Child Left Behind, which said, forget art, music, we got to focus on the four core, and that was it.
Even before.
That was in Indiana. We had Modern Red Schoolhouse, which was ran by the Hudson Institute, was to take arts education, personalized education out of the classroom.
I would say just drop down the controls a little bit and learn to find joy again. Just lost this.
In all aspects.
In all aspects.
Not just schools.
In all aspects. I would tie it again to rigor. It's just not serious enough. And play is learning. Learning is playing.
And I would say, just like what we're here today, the discourse, the conversation, the discussion, the education. I would go to any university, college campus, anywhere to have these kind of conversations, because you have the future educators, administrators, anyone could be in this room. When I talk about with young, especially young college students, even high schoolers, that about career and goals and where they want to go and what that looks like, it is like that rock wall we talked about down there. You can go sideways, up, down. There's no more a corporate ladder where you are sitting there and thinking you're going to go. I'm a prime example. I just even recertified. I have teaching certificate, superintendent certificate, all of it. And I will continue to do that because that's what's important, essential to me, what I believe in. But I sit in engineering at Microsoft, so it's that whole idea that we can educate others and we can be aware and we can be okay. It's okay if we fail. It's okay, the fair.
Right. A little song, a little dance, a little seltzer down your pants once in a while doesn't hurt anybody.
You know what? That's probably why I like to dance.
There you go.
And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Chris Bishop so he can, you got, okay. Thank you to our panel.
Yep, thank you once again to Dr. Levesque-Bristol, Dr. Gillespie, Dr. Watson, and Dr. Dever for the panel. So